Have you ever met someone so small they could barely reach your knee, yet they had the courage to change everything? Let me tell you about the day that happened to Adriano Marchetti. That the question came from a tiny voice. A voice so small it almost didn't belong in that enormous hallway. But it cut through the silence like a blade. Did you just call my mommy a liar? The little girl's name was Lily. She was barely 3 years old, clutching a worn brown teddy bear to her chest with both arms. Her dark curls were a mess, the way they always were, no matter how many times her mother tried to tame them. And she was standing right in front of the most dangerous man in all of New York City, looking straight up into his eyes. Adriano Marchetti. The name alone made people disappear. Restaurant owners suddenly remembered they were fully booked the moment his car pulled up. Politicians who acted untouchable answered their phones on the first ring when they saw his number. Men who had spent decades in the underworld lowered their voices when they spoke about him. And right now, this tiny girl was staring him down like he was nobody special. That the entire hallway went dead silent. Every guard, every staff member, every person in that corridor froze in place. No one had ever spoken to Adriano that way. No grown man had ever dared. Yet here was this child, barely reaching his knee, with her chin lifted and her eyes fierce, refusing to back down an inch. Behind her, Lily's mother stood frozen. Elena Carter's face had gone pale. Her hands trembled at her sides. She wanted to grab her daughter, to pull her away, to apologize 1,000 times. But she couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. She could only watch as the scene unfolded in front of her. And what happened next? No one in that room could have predicted. Because Adriano Marchetti, the man who had never shown mercy to anyone, the man who had built his empire on fear and iron control, did something that left every single person there too stunned to react. He lowered himself to one knee. Right there, in front of everyone. The guards along the walls. The maids pressed against the corridor. His most trusted lieutenant standing frozen behind him. The most feared man in New York knelt down until he was eye level with a 3-year-old girl holding a teddy bear. But before we get to that moment, before we understand how a tiny child with messy curls could bring a mafia boss to his knees, we need to go back. Because Adriano Marchetti hadn't always been this way. And the little girl with the teddy bear hadn't always lived in his house. The Marchetti estate sat behind 3 sets of iron gates, hidden inside a private forest on the outskirts of the city. The kind of place where secrets went to die. Hundreds of men served under Adriano. Bodyguards lined every corridor like silent shadows. Housekeepers moved with their eyes on the floor, never looking up, never asking questions. Everyone who stepped through those gates learned one thing very quickly. Adriano Marchetti had an unbreakable rule. He did not forgive lies. Not from his enemies. Not from his men. Not from anyone unfortunate enough to try. Those who worked closest to him whispered about it on the rare nights they dared to whisper at all. They said the rule had roots older than the empire itself. That it went back to a small boy standing in a crowded marketplace, watching a woman being called every ugly thing a stranger's mouth could form. That boy had screamed the truth back at the men who surrounded her. He had screamed until his throat gave out. And the truth had bought him nothing but a beating that he would carry inside his bones for the rest of his life. He had never been able to save his mother that day. So he had made sure, quietly and violently, that no one under his name would ever get away with lying to him again. Only one man in the world moved through those iron gates without flinching. His name was Salvatore Ricci. He had stood at Adriano's shoulder for 15 years. He had taken a bullet meant for Adriano in a warehouse near the harbor. He had pulled him bleeding from an ambush behind an old restaurant a year later. Adriano had never spoken the word brother out loud, but he wore the meaning of it in every choice he trusted Salvatore to make. On Salvatore's right hand sat a heavy silver signet ring, the Marchetti crest carved into it, a gift from Adriano himself the night of the harbor incident. The ring never left his finger. To the entire organization, that piece of silver meant one thing. Salvatore Ricci was untouchable because Adriano Marchetti had already decided so. Long after the guards had settled into their posts each night, Adriano returned alone to his private study. On a mahogany shelf against the far wall sat an antique gold mantel clock, delicate and old-fashioned, its face marked by the small imperfections of another century. It had belonged to his mother. It was the only piece of her he had ever been able to keep. Every night, without fail, he lifted a soft cloth and wiped the dust from its face. It was the closest thing to prayer that he had ever known. That the Marchetti estate held no laughter within its walls. No children ever. No warmth at all. Only power, silence, and one man who had never learned how to grieve properly. 2 years earlier, into the silence of that estate, a young woman had arrived carrying nothing but a battered suitcase and a baby wrapped against her chest. Her name was Elena Carter. She was 28, though the tiredness under her eyes had aged her further than the years alone. Lily's father had walked out on both of them when the baby was 6 months old. He had never sent so much as a birthday card since. Elena had no parents left, no siblings, no family that answered the phone anymore. When the housekeeping position at the Marchetti estate opened, she had taken it without asking a single question about the man who owned the house. She only asked whether her daughter could stay with her in the staff quarters. She had almost cried when the answer came back yes. For 2 years, she had kept her head down. She cleaned quietly, worked quickly, and never once let herself linger in the parts of the estate where she did not belong. The other staff barely knew her voice. Some of them thought she was shy. But she wasn't shy. She was simply a woman who had learned very early in life that keeping still and staying invisible was the only way to protect the small things you loved. The small thing she loved was named Lily. Lily was 3 years old, small even for her age, with dark curls that never stayed where Elena tried to put them, and a laugh that carried far too loudly through the quiet corridors. She dragged a brown teddy bear everywhere she went, its fur worn thin from being loved too hard. She had named him Mr. Buttons, even though not a single button had ever sat on him. She was afraid of nothing. Not the tall guards with earpieces, not the enormous rooms, not the shadows at the end of long hallways. She was far too little to understand what a mafia boss was, and Elena prayed daily that she would stay too little for a very long time. Margaret Whitfield, the head housekeeper who had served the Marchetti family for over 30 years, took Elena aside on her very first day, and again on her second, and again every week after that. The little one must not wander, she said, always in the same low, careful voice. Not into the West Wing. Not near the master's rooms. Not anywhere he might be. Do you understand me? Dear, for her sake more than yours. Elena always promised. She meant it every time. That one quiet afternoon, moving a stack of clean linens down the east corridor, Elena caught a glimpse of movement she hadn't expected. Rachel Adler, one of the younger maids, barely more than a girl herself, was slipping through the door of Adriano Marchetti's private study. She glanced quickly over her shoulder before pulling it shut behind her. Elena paused for half a second. Then she kept walking. She told herself it was probably nothing. Perhaps an errand. Perhaps a document being delivered. She was too tired to make it into a story, as she would remember that half-second later and wish she had made more of it that evening. Coming back from the kitchen, she heard the soft padding of small feet where no small feet should have been. Lily stood at the far corner of the main hallway, pressed against the wall like a tiny spy, peering around the corner into the grand dining room. Mr. Buttons hung from one hand. Her eyes were huge and serious. Elena hurried forward, ready to scoop her up before anyone noticed. But her daughter turned first, tugged gently at her mother's skirt, and whispered up at her with a puzzled little frown, "Mommy, why does that big man have nobody eating with him?" Elena looked past her at the far end of an enormous dining table meant to seat 20. Adriano Marchetti sat perfectly alone. A few mornings later, Margaret Whitfield found Elena in the laundry room and handed her a slip of paper with a room assignment written in careful blue ink. "You have been trusted with the master's private study today," the older woman said, and there was something almost solemn in her voice. "That room is not open to just anyone, dear. Do it well, do it carefully, and touch nothing that is not dust." Elena stared at the paper for a long moment before she nodded. In 2 full years at the estate, she had never once been sent into that room. Only 3 or 4 of the most senior staff had ever set foot inside it. She understood without being told that this was a quiet form of trust. And trust in this house was not given lightly. She tied her hair back, took her cleaning cart, and made her way up the west stairs with her heart beating a little faster than usual. The study was even more silent than the rest of the house. Heavy velvet drapes softened the morning light. Row after row of dark leather-bound books rose along the walls. A wide mahogany desk sat at the far end, its surface almost bare, and on a polished wooden shelf against the west wall stood an antique gold mantel clock. Delicate and old-fashioned, its face marked by the faint hairline scratches of another century. Elena knew, without being told, that she must not touch it. Something in the way it had been placed alone at eye level, given more space than anything else in the room, told her more than words ever could. She dusted carefully around it. She wiped the shelf beneath it. She held her breath every time her cloth passed close, then let it out again once her hand was safely away. When she finished, she checked the room twice. Everything was in its place. The clock ticked softly, as it had for 100 years. She gathered her card, pinned her completed assignment slip to the outside of the door as required, and made her way quietly back downstairs. She didn't know that later that afternoon, Rachel Adler would step through the same door with a folder of documents in her arms, sent up in a hurry to leave them on the desk for Salvatore. Rachel was moving too quickly. She had never been in the room before either, and she was nervous in a way that made her clumsy. Her elbow struck the shelf as she turned. The clock tilted, slid, felt the sound of it hitting the polished floor was small, almost dainty, and utterly final. Rachel froze. For several seconds, she simply stood there, staring at the shattered pieces of golden glass scattered across the dark wood. Then her eyes darted to the door. Pinned to the outside, still visible through the crack, was Elena Carter's completed cleaning slip from earlier that morning. Rachel's hand moved to her mouth. Her breath came out uneven. Then, without touching a single fragment of what she had broken, she slipped out into the hallway, closed the door behind her, and hurried away down the corridor as if she had never been there. An hour later, Adriano Marchetti opened the door to his private study. He stopped in the middle of a step. The color left his face all at once. He lowered himself slowly to one knee among the fragments and reached out. His hand was trembling. He lifted a single piece of shattered glass into his palm, the last small piece of his mother he had ever been able to hold. He rose from the floor with the fragment still resting in his hand. His face had gone very quiet in the way that everyone in the estate had long since learned to fear more than his shouting, "Send Margaret Whitfield up," he said without looking at the guard in the doorway. Now, the older woman arrived within minutes. She saw the shattered pieces on the floor and pressed one hand to her chest. But she did not speak until she was spoken to. "Who was assigned to this room today?" Adriano asked. Margaret swallowed. "Elena Carter, sir. Morning rotation. Bring her." Word moved through the corridors the way word always moved in that house. Silently, but with the speed of fire. By the time Elena stepped into the doorway of the study, half the household staff had already been gathered in the room behind her, lined up along the walls beside Adriano's guards. It was how the estate handled matters of trust. Everyone watched. Everyone remembered. Rachel Adler stood among them, folded into the second row, her eyes fixed on the floor. Elena's eyes found the broken pieces first. The blood left her face. "Sir," she said before he had spoken. I did not touch it. I dusted around it. I swear I did not touch it." Adriano lifted the fragment of glass slowly so that everyone in the room could see it resting in his palm. "This was on my shelf this morning. You were in this room alone. Now it is on my floor." His voice was cold enough to freeze the air between them. "Explain that to me." "I don't know how it happened, sir. I only know I did not do it." "You did not do it." "No, sir. I did not." He took one step closer. The guards along the walls did not move. "You broke it," he said quietly. "And now you are lying to me about it." Elena's hands trembled at her sides. Her voice trembled with them, but she did not lower her eyes. "I am not lying, sir. I would not lie to you. I did not touch it." Somewhere in the room, one of the maids caught her breath. No one else made a sound. Margaret Whitfield's hands were pressed tightly together in front of her, knuckles white. Adriano took another step. He was very close now. "In this house," he said, and his voice dropped so low that only the front row could hear it clearly. "I know when someone is lying to me. I always know." Elena opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Every answer she could offer was a variation of what she had already said. She was trapped in a room she had done nothing to deserve being trapped in. And there was no version of the truth that this man had already decided he would believe. She was still searching for words that did not exist when a sound cut through the silence. Footsteps. Small ones. Fast. Determined. Every head in the room turned toward the corridor. The heavy door of the study was pushed open by a hand far too little to belong to any adult. Lily stepped through. Her small chin was lifted. Her curls were still messy from the nap Elena had left her sleeping through downstairs. Both of her arms were wrapped tight around Mr. Buttons, holding him to her chest like a shield. Her eyes went straight to her mother, then straight to the man standing over her. And she began to walk forward for a long moment. No one in the room dared to move. The tiny girl with the teddy bear had already crossed the polished floor. She had already planted herself squarely in front of her mother. And then she asked the impossible question that no one under this roof had ever dreamed of asking. Did you just call my mommy a liar? Elena moved first. Her hand shot down toward her daughter's shoulder, quick and desperate. Lily, don't, she whispered. Sweetheart, come here. Come to mommy, please. Lily did not move. She did not even turn her head. Her small arms tightened around Mr. Buttons until his soft brown ears bent flat against her chest. Her chin lifted a fraction higher. Her eyes never left the man in front of her. My mommy doesn't lie, she said. Her voice was small, but there was nothing uncertain in it. My mommy never lies. Somewhere along the wall, one of the maids covered her mouth with both hands. Margaret Whitfield drew in a sharp, silent breath and did not release it. At the back of the room, standing just behind Adriano's shoulder, Salvatore Ricci had gone perfectly still. His hand had drifted halfway to the inside of his jacket out of pure instinct. And now he didn't know what to do with it. In 15 years at Adriano's side, he had seen his boss handle a great many things. He had never seen him handle this. That Adriano was not moving either. He was looking down at the child in front of him. And inside his chest, something very old had begun to stir. Something he had buried under 20 years of silence and violence and iron doors. For one strange moment, he was not standing in his own study at all. He was standing in a marketplace on the other side of a lifetime, watching a woman he loved be called every ugly word a stranger's mouth could form. And he was a small boy again, shouting the truth back at grown men with his throat tearing open, learning for the first time what it cost a child to defend the mother who could not defend herself. He did not raise his voice. He did not raise his hand. Instead, very slowly, in front of every guard along the wall, every maid holding her breath, Margaret Whitfield with her hands pressed to her mouth, and Salvatore Ricci standing frozen behind him. Adriano Marchetti lowered himself to one knee. At the whole room made a soft, involuntary sound. Not words, just the small collective intake of breath that came from watching something impossible happen in real time. He was now at Lily's eye level. The distance between them was suddenly very small. Little one, he said. His voice was quieter than any of them had ever heard it. Listen to me. I'm going to find out what really happened here. And if your mother did not do this thing, I will make it right. Every part of it. I promise you that. Lily looked at him for a very long moment, weighing his face the way only a child can. Then, satisfied by something no adult in that room could name, she gave one small, serious nod up behind her. Elena's control finally broke. A single sob escaped before she pressed her hand against her mouth to trap the rest. Behind Adriano, Salvatore Ricci was watching his boss kneel to a housekeeper's child. For the first time in 15 years, something inside him had begun, very quietly, to calculate. Adriano rose slowly to his feet. His expression had not shifted, but the temperature in the room had. Every guard along the wall felt it before he said a single word. Everyone out. Now, he didn't look at any of them. Dominic, stay. The staff filed out in silence. Rachel Adler carried along in the middle of them, her eyes still glued to the floor. Elena gathered her daughter into her arms without a word and slipped out behind the others, her hands trembling against her child's back. Only Dominic Russo remained. Dominic was one of Adriano's most trusted lieutenants, a quiet, unshowy man who had never once been part of Salvatore's inner circle and had never asked to be. Adriano trusted his eyes more than most men trusted their brothers. The corridor cameras outside this door, Adriano said. From this morning until this hour. Pull the footage yourself. Bring it to me directly. No copies. No mention of it to anyone. Do you understand me? Yes, sir. Within the hour, Adriano was watching a small monitor in a locked back office. And the truth of the morning played out in front of him in silent gray footage. There was Elena entering the study with her cleaning cart, working carefully, leaving quietly, pinning her completed assignment slip to the outside of the door. The corridor sat empty for a long stretch of time. Then Rachel Adler appeared, a folder of documents pressed to her chest. Walking quickly, She glanced once over her shoulder before slipping inside. She was in the room for less than 3 minutes. When she emerged, her face was the color of chalk. She didn't look at the door. She didn't close it properly. She hurried away down the corridor as if something were chasing her. Adriano didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Rachel was summoned to the study an hour later. She stepped through the door, saw Adriano standing quietly behind his desk, and every excuse she had rehearsed on the way up died in her throat. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He simply looked at her. That was enough. She broke within seconds. The whole confession tumbled out between sobs. The elbow that struck the shelf. The panic. The assignment slip pinned to the door. The seizing of an opportunity she had never planned to take. She kept saying she was sorry. She kept saying she hadn't meant it. She kept saying she would do anything. You will pack your things, Adriano said when she finally ran out of words. You will leave this estate tonight. You will never return. And you will never mention my name again. That is the mercy you are receiving, and it is more than you have earned. Get out. She was gone within the hour. Adriano didn't sleep that night. Just before dawn, he walked the length of the estate alone, down through the corridors that led to the staff quarters. He stopped in front of a small wooden door with a hand-drawn crayon flower taped to it. And he raised his hand and knocked. Delena opened the door with her hair loose and her eyes swollen from a night of not sleeping. She stopped breathing when she saw who was standing on the other side. He didn't enter. He simply stood in the corridor with his hands loose at his sides and said in a voice that most of his men had never heard him use in their lives. I was wrong. I apologize. Elena couldn't speak. She could only stand there and stare at him, one hand still resting on the doorframe. Adriano gave her one small nod, turned, and began to walk away. Behind Elena, a small brown teddy bear appeared first, then 2 dark, serious eyes. Then Lily's whole face, peeking around her mother's legs. I told you, Lily said very solemnly. Adriano paused mid-step in the corridor. He didn't turn around. The corner of his mouth twitched, the first almost smile in years. And then he kept walking. In the days that followed, the estate began to change in ways almost no one could name. Lily was no longer afraid of him. She had never been very afraid to begin with. But now she was something worse. She was curious, and a curious 3-year-old with a teddy bear was a force that no bodyguard in that house had been trained to stop. As she began to appear in places she absolutely didn't belong. She wandered into the west corridor with a piece of paper clutched in one hand and Mr. Buttons in the other, presenting Adriano with drawings of houses that were mostly triangles and suns that had far too many rays. She turned up at the doorway of his private study and asked, with the seriousness of a small judge, why he always looked as though he was angry at the whole world. She stood beside his enormous dining table one evening and inquired why grown-up food came on such enormous plates when he only ever seemed to eat a little. Elena chased her down the hallways with panic in her chest. She apologized every single time. I'm so sorry, sir. I'll take her. It won't happen again. I promise. Leave her, Adriano said one afternoon without looking up from his papers. She isn't bothering me. Elena didn't know what to do with that answer, so she said nothing at all. She took her daughter's hand and walked her back down the hallway with her heart doing something complicated inside her chest. That one late afternoon, cutting through the east corridor with a folder under his arm, Adriano stopped short. Lily was sitting cross-legged on the polished floor, hunched over a sheet of paper with 3 short, broken stubs of colored crayons spread out in front of her. She was trying to draw a garden. The stubs kept slipping out of her small fingers. She didn't complain. She didn't cry. She simply picked each piece up again, adjusted her grip, and kept going until the flowers on her page had every color she had left. Adriano watched her for a long moment. He didn't say a word. He kept walking. The next morning, a large flat box appeared on the floor outside the door of the staff quarters. A brand new set of colored pencils and a fresh drawing pad, still in their wrapping. There was no name on the box. There didn't need to be. Lily knew instantly. Elena knew a heartbeat later. By the time she opened the box, Lily was already running. 2 floors above, Adriano was seated at the head of a long conference table, chairing a formal meeting with 6 of his most senior lieutenants. Salvatore Ricci sat at his right. Serious men in dark suits leaned forward over documents. The doors were closed. The guards outside had strict orders that no one was to enter. The double doors burst open anyway. A tiny figure in a small pink dress came running full tilt down the length of the room. Dark curls bouncing. Teddy bear pressed to her chest. She flew past a wall of stunned men in dark jackets, past chairs and briefcases and untouched coffee cups, straight to the head of the table. She wrapped both arms around Adriano's leg and buried her face against his knee. Every man in the room froze in place. Adriano did not move for a long, long moment. His hand was still resting on a document he had been about to sign. Then, very slowly and very awkwardly, he lifted that hand and placed it gently on top of Lily's small dark head. The most feared man in New York didn't say a single word. No one in that room ever forgot what they had just seen at Adriano's right. Hidden beneath the polished edge of the table, Salvatore Ricci's hand closed slowly into a fist. At the morning after the meeting, a small blue chair appeared in Adriano's private study. No one had been told to bring it in. No note was pinned to it. It simply sat there beside his mahogany desk, low enough for a 3-year-old's feet to touch the floor, with a fresh drawing pad and the new set of colored pencils placed carefully on the seat. Lily found it before lunchtime. From that day forward, she sat in it. Not every hour, not every day, but often enough that the maids stopped remarking on it, and often enough that the guards along the west corridor learned to nod at her the way they would nod at anyone who lived in the house, as she drew while Adriano worked. She hummed softly to herself. She asked him questions about the papers on his desk, and Adriano, who had spent 20 years explaining nothing to anyone, began to answer her in words a small child could understand. "That is a contract," he said one afternoon without looking up. "It means two people are promising each other something in writing. Like a pinky promise. A more expensive kind of pinky promise." Lily thought about that for a long moment. Then she went back to her drawing. She looked up again some minutes later, chin resting on the edge of the desk. "Why does Uncle Salvatore look at you funny?" Adriano's pen paused above the page. "Funny how?" he asked mildly, like he's angry, but pretending he isn't. Adriano gave a soft, dismissive laugh and turned back to his papers. "You are imagining things, little one. Draw me another flower." She did, but he didn't forget the question. Somewhere in the quiet back of his mind, it settled itself onto a shelf where he could reach for it later. Delana watched all of this from a distance, and she didn't know what to do with what she was seeing. She caught the small changes she wasn't supposed to catch. The way Adriano's shoulders dropped a fraction the moment his car pulled through the gates each evening. The way he lingered 5 extra minutes at the breakfast table on the mornings Lily was near. The way his voice softened without him seeming to notice when he spoke her daughter's name. Elena told herself again and again that she was imagining it. She told herself she was tired. She told herself that hope was the most dangerous thing a woman in her position could allow herself to feel. She didn't stop feeling it. Salvatore Ricci watched the same thing she watched. He said nothing. His silver signet ring caught the light every time he lifted his glass at the long conference table. And no one in the household noticed how often lately his eyes were on the small blue chair by the window instead of on the papers in front of him. One evening near the end of that week, Adriano did something the estate had never known him to do. He arranged a family dinner for the household staff. Long trestle tables were set in the smaller dining room. Cooks brought out simple, warm food. Maids and grooms and guards sat together in a way none of them had ever sat in that house before. Margaret Whitfield pressed her lips together to hide a smile she hadn't worn in years. That Lily arrived holding her mother's hand. She looked once at the seat next to Adriano. Then she walked straight to it, climbed up on her own, and folded her small hands neatly in her lap. "Lily," Elena whispered, mortified. "Sweetheart, that is not for you. She is fine there," Adriano said without lifting his eyes from his glass. "Leave her." Elena sank into her seat across the table. When she finally dared to look up, Adriano was already looking at her. Neither of them spoke. Something wordless passed between them that neither of them dared yet to name. A few nights after the family dinner, Lily refused to sleep. She had spent the whole evening drawing at the small blue chair in the study and had come back to the staff quarters with her cheeks flushed and her small mind still spinning. She kicked her blanket off. She sat up in bed. She lay down again. She demanded a story, then rejected 2 of them halfway through. Elena finally gave up on rocking her and slipped out to the main kitchen to make her a small cup of warm chamomile. The estate was almost silent at that hour. A single low light burned above the kitchen counter. Elena moved carefully, whisking the kettle off the stove before it could sing. She didn't hear him come in. Trouble sleeping. Elena nearly dropped the cup. She turned quickly, one hand pressed to her chest. Adriano stood in the doorway in a simple dark shirt with the sleeves pushed up. No jacket. Without the men who usually trailed 2 steps behind him. He looked for once only like a man who had come downstairs for a glass of water. Lily, sir. She's overexcited. She lowered her eyes. I'm sorry. We didn't mean to disturb you. You didn't. I was awake. He crossed the kitchen quietly, filled a glass at the sink, and turned to lean against the counter opposite her. He didn't sit. He didn't tell her to her father, he said after a moment. It wasn't a question. Elena's hands tightened around the little cup. He left when Lily was 6 months old. Sir, he didn't want a wife who was tired all the time and a baby who cried at night. He didn't send a card. He didn't send a single dollar. I haven't heard his voice in 3 years. Adriano was quiet for a long moment. Some men do not deserve what they walk away from, he said finally. Her throat closed. She had to look down at the cup to keep her face steady. She spoke again a moment later, mostly because the silence was becoming unbearable. My parents are both gone, sir. I was an only child. Before I came here, I moved a great many times. Small rooms, other people's couches, whatever I could afford with a baby on my hip. This job was the first door in 2 years that did not close in my face. He listened without moving. The stillness in him had changed shape. It was no longer the stillness that had frightened her the first year she worked in this house. It was something closer to attention. The way a man listens when he has decided that the words in front of him actually mattered. He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't offer her promises he couldn't keep. He simply let her be heard. When she finally lifted her cup, she realized her tea had gone lukewarm. I should take this up to her, sir, before she starts singing again. She stepped past him toward the doorway. She was almost through it when his voice stopped her. Quieter than she had ever heard it. Elena. She turned. This estate is safer for both of you than anywhere else in this city, he said. Please do not ever feel that you need to leave. She couldn't answer. She only nodded once and stepped out into the corridor. She was halfway down the long hallway back to the staff quarters, cup of lukewarm tea warm in her hands, when she caught her own reflection in a darkened window and stopped walking. She had been smiling. She didn't know for how long. She wiped the smile away as though it were something dangerous and hurried on. A little more than a week later, in the small hours before dawn, Lily had her first nightmare in months. Elena didn't hear her. She was down in the basement laundry with Margaret Whitfield, sleeves rolled up, folding sheets that had come out of the dryer too warm. There was a linen crisis for a private breakfast the next morning, and the 2 women had been quietly working through it for over an hour. Elena had left Lily sleeping soundly, curled around Mr. Buttons the way she always slept. The child woke up crying. She sat up in the dark, her small chest heaving, tears already spilling before her eyes had fully opened. She reached for her mother. Her mother wasn't there. She reached for the small night lamp. It was too far away. Half asleep and completely frightened, she slipped off the bed with Mr. Buttons dangling from one hand and pushed open the door of the tiny bedroom. She didn't walk toward the basement stairs where her mother was. She walked without knowing she was doing it in the opposite direction, through the long staff corridor, past the sleeping wing, up the servants' back stairs and out into the hushed marble of the west wing. Her small bare feet padded softly along the polished floor. Mr. Buttons dragged along beside her. Her cheeks were wet and shining in the low corridor lights. The place she was walking toward without ever having decided it was the only place in the entire estate she had come to associate with safety. That the door to Adriano's private study was half open. A single lamp burned inside. He was still at his desk. He slept very little and never before 3 in the morning. He looked up at the soft sound of a small body brushing against the door frame. For a moment, he thought he was imagining her. Then he saw her face. He was on his feet before the pen had finished falling to the desk. He crossed the room in 3 strides and stopped in front of her. And for one strange suspended moment, he didn't know what to do with his own hands. He had held guns. He had held contracts. He had held men by the collar of their shirts. He had never in his life picked up a child. He hesitated only for that heartbeat. Then, very carefully, as if she might shatter, he crouched down and slid one arm behind her small back and the other beneath her tiny legs. And he lifted her. Lily curled into him instantly. Her arms went around his neck. Mr. Buttons was pressed between her chest and his. one soft brown ear flattened against Adriano's shirt. She buried her face in the crook of his shoulder and cried and cried and slowly, softly cried herself out. Her body went heavy and warm against him. Her breathing slowed. She was asleep that Adriano didn't move. He stood in the middle of his own study with a sleeping 3-year-old in his arms, and he didn't know how long he stood there. Eventually, without waking her, he walked to the tall window that overlooked the front drive. He watched the estate lights burn in the darkness. He felt her small heart beating against his own. He felt something so foreign, so unfamiliar that it frightened him more than any enemy ever had. He didn't hear footsteps in the corridor that Elena appeared in the doorway looking for her daughter and stopped as though she had walked into a wall. In the low lamplight, the most feared man in New York was holding her child against his heart. Something inside her that she had believed dead for 3 years quietly broke open. Adriano met her eyes across the room. His voice was barely a whisper. "She's fine. Let her sleep." Elena didn't leave. The three of them stayed there in silence until dawn. The envelope arrived at Adriano's office 3 days later, tucked in the middle of a stack of ordinary correspondence. Unmarked. No return address. He opened it himself. Inside was a single photograph. Lily laughing in the back garden of the estate. She was sitting in the grass with Mr. Buttons on her lap and a fistful of small yellow flowers. She had clearly picked without permission. She didn't know the camera was there. Whoever had taken the picture had done so from beyond the outer wall, with a long telephoto lens. From a distance, no ordinary passerby could have managed that. On the back of the photograph, in thick block letters that had been pressed in with something sharp, ran a single line. "Even your weak point can be seen. Next time, it will not only be a picture." At the bottom corner, a small mark had been pressed into the paper. Adriano recognized it before his hand had finished lowering the photograph to the desk. It was a symbol that had appeared on the doors of 3 of his men years ago, on a night none of them had survived. It was the mark of the Bianchi family. The oldest, coldest enemy of the Marchetti named Adriano's blood turned to ice in a way it hadn't done in 20 years. Salvatore was in the office when he opened it. He crossed to the desk in 2 quick strides, saw the image, saw the writing, saw the mark. His jaw tightened. He set his hand on the back of Adriano's chair. "Give me 12 hours, he said, low and immediate. "I take 4 men. I go tonight. I make them regret ever printing that photograph. She never sees the outside of these walls unprotected again." "You will stand down," Adriano said quietly. "You will stand down until I have real intelligence in my hand." He didn't look up. "The Bianchis have wanted a war with us for 20 years and never had the nerve to start one. Something is different now. I want to know what before I move." Salvatore held his silence for a long moment. Then he nodded once and stepped back. Within the hour, the estate went into a lockdown that felt to anyone who lived inside its walls almost invisible from the outside and absolute from the inside. Extra guards took posts in the garden. 2 additional cars ran perimeter sweeps every 20 minutes. Elena's scheduled day off that week was quietly canceled by Margaret Whitfield, who apologized with an expression Elena had never seen on her face before. Elena didn't ask why. She had been in this house long enough to know that certain questions didn't receive answers that night. After everyone else in the estate had gone to bed, Adriano stood alone in his private study with the photograph in his hand. He looked at his daughter for the first time without correcting the thought. Laughing in a garden she didn't know had eyes on it. For 20 years, he had built walls no enemy in this city had ever managed to breach. He had made himself unreachable by every method known to their trade. He had believed in the coldest and most honest hours of his life that having nothing to lose was the only true form of safety. He had been wrong. Loving something, even in silence, had made him weaker than any of them. He set the photograph carefully in his top drawer and locked it. Later, when the last light in the staff quarters had gone out, he walked the long corridor down himself. He eased open the door of Elena's small bedroom. Lily was sound asleep, curled around her teddy bear, one small hand fisted in his soft brown fur. Adriano crossed the room silently. He lifted Mr. Buttons from her arms with the care of a man diffusing something precious. From his pocket, he took a very small object, no larger than a grain of rice, and slipped it deep into the stitching along one worn seam. He placed the bear back exactly where it had been. Lily never stirred. By the following afternoon, Adriano had already made his decision. Elena and Lily would leave the estate, only for a short while, only until he could tear the Bianchis apart at the root and make certain no one on that side of the city ever aimed a lens at his front garden again. But they would leave. He worked through the plan in his private study behind a closed door, alone. There was a small property he owned upstate that appeared on no Marchetti record and no Marchetti map. He had bought it years ago through 3 shell companies under a name he had never used again. Even his own accountants had no idea it existed. The couple who kept the grounds were people he had trusted since long before Salvatore ever wore the silver signet ring. Quiet, older, entirely outside the organization. He would move Elena and Lily there under new documents, new names, a new small routine. A tutor for Lily, a safeguarden, a back road out of the property that even his best men wouldn't be able to trace. Every detail was designed with only one purpose: to keep them alive. He was, however, a man who had never in his life learned how to explain something gentle to someone he cared about. That he called Elena to the study late that afternoon. She stepped in with her hands folded in front of her, the same careful posture she had used in this house for 2 years. He was standing behind his desk, papers already gathered, sleeves already pushed up. He didn't sit. He didn't offer her a chair. "You and Lily will be leaving the estate for a while," he said. "Pack lightly. I will have the arrangements finished by tomorrow evening." Elena's face lost its color in a single breath. For a long moment, she couldn't speak. She had spent the last 2 years bracing quietly for a moment exactly like this one. A man like Adriano Marchetti in a house like this one, growing tired of a housekeeper's child underfoot, growing tired of a woman who had never belonged in the first place. She had told herself she was ready for the day the door closed on the two of them again. She discovered standing there that she had never been ready at all. She didn't ask why. She didn't ask where. She didn't ask for anything. She only nodded once. "I understand, sir." And she turned and walked out of the room before he could see her eyes filled that Adriano was still holding the folder. When the door closed behind her, he opened his mouth. He closed it again. The words he had needed to add, the words that would have changed everything. The words that explained the safe house and the tutor and the back road and the fact that leaving meant coming back. They remained trapped somewhere between his chest and his mouth, exactly as they always had. Just outside the study, in the little alcove beside the corridor, Lily had been sitting on the floor, drawing houses with the new colored pencils. She hadn't meant to listen. She had simply been there. She heard her mother's voice crack on the words, "I understand, sir." She heard the door open. She saw Elena walk past her in the corridor with her chin lifted and her mouth pressed shut, and her eyes very bright that her mother didn't see her. Her mother walked right past the small figure on the floor, one hand pressed briefly to her own mouth, and disappeared around the corner. Lily sat very still with her pencil forgotten in her fingers, the small, careful heart inside her chest, the heart that had begun to believe this cold, beautiful house was slowly, quietly turning into home. It cracked cleanly down the middle in the silence that followed that night. Long after the estate had gone quiet, a small pair of bare feet padded slowly along the west corridor. Lily hadn't been able to sleep. Elena had put her to bed with an unusual softness in her voice, kissed her forehead twice instead of once, and then turned her face to the wall so that her shoulders wouldn't shake where the child could see. Lily had waited, eyes open in the dark, until the sound of her mother's breathing evened out. Then she had slipped out of bed, tucked Mr. Buttons tightly under one arm, and set out on her own. She didn't know the words for what she was feeling. She only knew where her feet needed to go. That the door of Adriano's study was ajar. A single lamp burned inside. He was at his desk, working through a stack of documents he didn't really see. He had been holding the same pen for almost an hour. He glanced up automatically at the small sound of the door creaking. He froze. She was standing in the doorway, barefoot, in the little cotton nightdress her mother had washed thin from too many washings. Her hair was tangled from the pillow. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen and trying very hard to be brave. Mr. Buttons was clutched to her chest so tightly that his ears were bent flat. She didn't step inside. She didn't need to. Her voice came out smaller than her 3 years should have allowed. "You don't want Lily and Mommy here anymore, do you?" Adriano was out of his chair before he understood he had moved. He crossed the room in 3 strides. And for the second time in a matter of weeks, in front of no one but a child, the most feared man in New York went down on one knee. He didn't bother to hide this time how much her question had struck him. He didn't have that kind of composure left tonight. "Little one," he said. His voice was rough. "No. Listen to me. That is not what this is." She looked at him and waited. The way only a very small person can wait for the truth. "There are some people out there who I have to make go away for a while," he said carefully. "Bad people. Grown-up people. They are looking at this house in a way I do not like. I want you and your mommy to go somewhere quiet and beautiful for a little while. Only until I have finished with them. That is all. Going away for a small time means coming home to stay for a very long time. Do you understand?" Lily searched his face. He held very still and let her, then in a voice that was somehow even smaller than the first one, she asked, "And you won't leave mommy all by herself, will you, because mommy cries at nighttime when she thinks nobody sees her?" Adriano didn't move. He couldn't have moved. Somewhere in the center of him, a wall that had stood for 20 years came down without a sound. Very carefully, he reached out and took both of her tiny hands in his one after the other, folded around Mr. Button's. "I will not leave your mommy all by herself," he said quietly. "I promise you that." He walked her back down the corridor to the staff quarters himself. He watched her climb into bed beside her mother and burrow under the blanket without waking her. He stood outside the closed door of that small room for a very long time before he made himself turn around. By the time he reached his own study, he had understood. These two were no longer anything he could pretend to be indifferent to. While Adriano was still standing outside the closed door of the staff quarters that night, Dominic Russo was 3 floors below him in a locked back office, quietly building the case that would change everything. Adriano had ordered a private audit of the Bianchi intelligence the same day the photograph had arrived. Not through Salvatore's chain, not through the senior lieutenants, only through Dominic and 2 of the quietest analysts in the organization. Men who didn't speak at meetings and didn't drink at dinners and had never been welcomed into Salvatore's private circle for 3 straight nights. They had gone through every angle of the threat. Something didn't fit that the photograph of Lily in the garden had been taken through the trees on the west side of the property. Dominic had walked the perimeter himself twice at the same hour of day the picture had been shot. He had come back convinced there was only one line of sight from beyond the outer wall that could have produced that exact frame. That line of sight passed through a very specific gap in the security grid, a narrow, angled blind spot that any ordinary observer would have missed entirely. Only 3 men in the entire Marchetti organization had ever mapped that blind spot. 2 of them were already dead. Old work, old contracts, both years in the ground. The 3rd man was Salvatore Ricci. That alone wouldn't have been enough to convince Adriano. It might have been coincidence. Dominic kept digging. Bank tracing over the last 3 months quietly opened up an ugly picture. A shell company registered in the name of a shipping consultant no one could locate had been receiving small, steady payments from a laundering firm that sat 2 removes from a known Bianchi front. From that shell company, money moved twice through another empty name, then into a numbered offshore account. The account was held in the name of Salvatore Ricci's cousin, a cousin who worked at a diner in Queens and had never in his life owned anything larger than a used car. The payments had begun 8 months ago. Dominic set the folder down on Adriano's desk in the small locked back office at close to 3 in the morning and stepped back without a word. Adriano read every page. He didn't speak. He didn't lift his eyes. His face didn't change. But when he finally closed the folder and set his palms flat against the desk, the skin across his knuckles had gone bloodless white. 15 years. The man who had taken a bullet for him at the harbor. The man who had pulled him out of an alley behind a burning restaurant. The man he had never once called brother out loud because he had never needed to say it. That man had been selling him for 8 months. Selling territory, selling movements, selling everything that made Adriano Marchetti untouchable in this city. Waiting patiently for the moment his boss became distracted enough to be replaced. And that moment had arrived the day a 3-year-old girl walked into his study with a teddy bear. Salvatore knew. Salvatore knew exactly where Adriano's weakness now lived. Dominic. Adriano's voice was flat. "Sir, you will go to the staff quarters tonight personally. You will take Elena and Lily to the upstate house. You will use the back road. You will not radio ahead. You will not tell a single man on the perimeter who is in the car. Salvatore is to hear nothing. Do you understand me?" "Understood. Go now." Dominic didn't ask a second question. He left. Adriano remained alone at the desk in the dark of the back office for a very long time. Slowly, With the coldest clarity of his adult life, he began to accept a truth that changed the shape of everything. The danger to his child was not coming from beyond the walls of his home. It was coming from inside them. He picked up his phone. Over the next 48 hours, without a single meeting, without a single announcement, without a single word to the man who had stood at his right shoulder for 15 years, half of the estate's response team quietly began reporting to Dominic Russo instead. Salvatore Ricci noticed nothing. Adriano made very certain of that. If there was one obstacle to moving Elena and Lily out of the estate quietly, and it had been on the calendar for nearly a year. The Marchetti Annual Charity Gala. 200 of the city's most powerful guests. Reporters, politicians, a senator's wife. Every major crime family in the Northeast sending a polite representative in a tuxedo. To cancel it now at the last hour would have put Salvatore Ricci on the highest alert of his life. Adriano couldn't afford that. Not tonight. Not before Lily was safely upstate. So the gala went ahead exactly as planned. Elena was asked to help oversee the household staff for the evening. The extra caterers, the coat check, the wine service. Margaret Whitfield promised personally that Lily would remain in the staff quarters under the eye of one of the older maids until Elena finished her shift and could come and collect her. Lily went obediently to bed with Mr. Buttons tucked tight under her chin. In the ballroom, chandeliers burned. String music drifted between conversations. Adriano moved through the crowd in a black dinner jacket, shaking hands he didn't want to shake, smiling with only the lower half of his face. Salvatore Ricci stood along the wall in his usual place. Watching him, Salvatore had noticed something. For 3 days now, small things at the estate hadn't fit. Standing orders had shifted without any memos crossing his desk. 2 of the men he had personally trained had suddenly stopped answering to him. Tonight, Adriano was moving through the ballroom with an ease that was almost too easy. A man who suspected nothing didn't smile that carefully. Salvatore made his decision between the 3rd and 4th courses. He wouldn't wait. He slipped away from the ballroom through the service corridor at exactly 10 minutes past 9. 2 of his personal men were already positioned near the North Staff Wing, per the plan he had laid down weeks earlier. A plan that used every security gap he himself had designed into the estate over the last 15 years. The older maid who had been watching Lily was quietly called away to help with an urgent broken glass in the kitchen. She hurried off without thinking to lock the door behind her. Lily was carried through the service corridor, still half asleep. She woke up somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd turns. Saw an unfamiliar face too close to her own and understood in the animal way small children understand danger that this was wrong. As she fought. She kicked. She twisted. She sank her small teeth into the wrist of the man, carrying her hard enough to draw blood. He cursed loudly enough that the second man clapped a hand across his own mouth in warning. In the scuffle, a small brown teddy bear slipped out from under her arm and tumbled to the polished floor of the service corridor. They didn't stop to pick him up. 20 minutes later, Elena walked down that same corridor with a stack of clean linen napkins for the ballroom. She saw Mr. Buttons on the floor. The napkins fell from her arms, but she didn't scream. She simply picked the bear up in shaking hands and ran in her full evening uniform straight through 2 service doors and into the middle of the ballroom. She reached Adriano in front of 200 guests. She didn't care as she grabbed his sleeve. Adriano turned, ready to smooth over whatever emergency had come. And then he saw what she was holding. Every drop of color left his face. He excused himself to the senator's wife with a smile so calm it was terrifying. He set down his glass. He walked out of the ballroom without another word to anyone. By the time he reached the corridor, his eyes had turned the color of iron. He lifted Mr. Buttons gently from Elena's trembling hands. "I know exactly where she is," he said, quiet as a blade. "And I know exactly who took her." Adriano didn't raise his voice inside that corridor. He didn't have to. Within 9 minutes, the estate had emptied of every man he needed. Not one of them moved through Salvatore Ricci's chain of command. Every order flowed through Dominic Russo, the quiet lieutenant who for 2 full days now had been the true center of the Marchetti response team, without a single word being spoken about it. 2 dark vehicles waited at the service gate. Elena was already standing at the door of the first car when Adriano reached it. "You will stay here," he said. "There is a room in the West Wing. Margaret Whitfield will. I am going with you." "Elena, I am going with you." Her voice was low and shaking, and completely immovable. You do not get to leave me here holding her teddy bear. Adriano looked at her for one long second. Then he stepped aside and let her climb into the second car. The convoy moved out through the back road with no headlights on for the first mile. In the front seat of the lead vehicle, Dominic worked a small tablet against his knee. The tracking device Adriano had slipped into the seam of Mr. Button's weeks earlier, on the night the Bianchi photograph had arrived, was answering back. A small red dot glowed steady on the screen. East River, Dominic said. Warehouse on Pier 16. Owned through a Bianchi shell for 11 years. How many with him? 3 at the door. 1 inside on the child. Adriano's phone buzzed against his palm. The screen showed a number he hadn't seen dial him in 15 years. He answered without speaking to, "You know where I am." Salvatore's voice was almost gentle. "Come alone, Adriano. Talk to me like a brother one last time. Or the little girl finds out what warehouses were built for. I am on my way." Adriano ended the call. The warehouse door was unlocked when he reached it. He walked in alone, hands loose at his sides, coat unbuttoned. Above him, high in the dark rafters, a small square of glass had been quietly removed 40 minutes earlier by 3 of Dominic's men. Salvatore was standing in a pool of yellow light in the middle of the concrete floor. Behind him, in a wooden chair, sat Lily. Her wrists were tied loosely. Her hair was a mess. Her small cheeks were dirty with tears she had already cried herself out of. She wasn't sobbing now. Her small chin was lifted the exact way Elena's lifted when Elena was frightened but refused to be seen frightened. And when she saw Adriano across the room, her whole body went very still. The way a child goes still when she has decided to be brave. Salvatore smiled. It was almost the old smile. Almost the one Adriano had trusted for 15 years. There he is. He spread his hands. Now we talk business. The Manhattan routes. The 2 Brooklyn houses. The Northern Shipping Line. All of it signed to my name by dawn. You take a formal retirement. You keep your life. You keep hers. He tilted his head toward Lily without turning. You will not risk her. I know you, Adriano. I have known you for 15 years. Adriano didn't answer him. He wasn't looking at Salvatore. He was looking past him at the small girl in the wooden chair and at the small lifted chin that was so much like her mother's. You made one mistake, Salvatore, he said quietly. Salvatore blinked. What? You thought I still cared about the Empire more than I cared about her. In the same second, the removed pane of glass fell. The warehouse doors blew inward from 3 sides at once. Dominic's men had been positioned around that building for the last 2 hours. The next few seconds happened all at once. Gunfire cracked from 3 directions. Men shouted. A heavy metal table went over on its side with a scream of protest against the concrete. The single yellow light above Salvatore swung wildly on its wire and threw long, jerking shadows across the warehouse walls. Adriano didn't fire. He didn't draw. He moved through the chaos with a single focus in his head. And that focus was a small wooden chair in the middle of the floor. Salvatore understood half a second too late what was happening. His hand shot toward Lily. Not to protect her, but to lift her. To put her between himself and the man he had spent 15 years standing beside. He got 2 steps. Dominic Russo dropped him with 2 clean shots before his fingers ever reached her. Salvatore went down hard onto the concrete. The heavy silver signet ring on his hand skittered loose and rolled several feet away into the dark. The other 2 men who had been holding the pier fell within the same handful of heartbeats. The last of them, cornered against a stack of crates, dropped his weapon and raised his hands. Silence poured in behind the noise like water. Adriano was already at the chair. Lily hadn't moved. Her small shoulders were shaking so hard the wooden legs of the chair rattled softly against the floor. Her eyes were huge and glassy and locked on his face, as if she was afraid to blink in case he vanished. Her cheeks were streaked. Her hair was damp against her forehead. Her small fists were clenched around the loose loops of rope at her wrists. Adriano went down on one knee in front of her the way he had gone down on one knee for her twice before. His hands, which had held guns without shaking for 20 years, were remarkably steady as he worked the knots free. The rope fell away. He slid one arm behind her small back and the other beneath her tiny legs, and he lifted her against his chest exactly the way he had lifted her the night of the nightmare. The moment his arms closed around her, her whole body stopped shaking. The footsteps rang on the concrete behind him. Elena had come through the doors on Dominic's heels. She was wearing a coat thrown over her evening uniform and no shoes suitable for a peer. Her face was almost the color of the pale ballroom napkins she had been carrying an hour ago. She stopped a few feet from them. Her hands came up in front of her mouth. She didn't make a single sound. Adriano looked at her over the small shoulder of her daughter. Something wordless and enormous broke between them in that look. Something neither of them had let themselves say out loud yet, and something neither of them would ever again need to. Lily stirred against his neck. She lifted her head just enough to bury her face into the warm curve where his shoulder met his throat. Then, into his skin, she cried the single word that had lived inside her chest, unspoken for weeks, "Daddy." The sound of it was half a sob and half a question. It landed in the middle of Adriano's chest like a bullet made of light. Every man still standing in that warehouse heard it. Not one of them moved. Adriano pulled her closer. His voice, when it came out, was rough enough to break. "Daddy is here," he said into her hair. "Daddy is here." A few feet away, Elena finally broke. She pressed both hands harder against her mouth and wept without sound as Salvatore Ricci, dying on the cold concrete, turned his head just enough to see them. He understood in his last conscious seconds that he had lost. This war the moment he had ever believed Adriano Marchetti's heart was still empty. Adriano carried Lily out of that warehouse himself. He didn't let anyone else touch her. Elena walked pressed close against his side. Behind them along the water, the warehouse had begun to burn. For days passed before the estate found its silence again. The Bianchi family, in the course of a single night, had learned what happened to men who aimed cameras at Adriano Marchetti's front garden. Whatever war they had thought they were preparing to start had been dismantled by dawn, quietly and without headlines, in ways no one in that side of the city would soon be able to reassemble inside the Marchetti house. The network Salvatore had spent 8 months building had been pulled up by the roots. Names were taken. Doors were closed. Nothing of him remained except the empty chair at the long conference table. And even that was quietly removed on the third day. Lily slept. She slept a great deal in those first days. Elena didn't leave her side. She lay curled against her mother in the narrow bed of the staff quarters, Mr. Buttons tucked under her chin, one small hand fisted in the fabric of Elena's shirt as though she was afraid, even in dreams, of being carried away from her again. Adriano visited only twice. Briefly, and only to see that she was breathing. On the fourth evening, long after the household had gone quiet, he walked down the long corridor to the staff quarters alone. Not to his study, not to the dining hall, not to any of the rooms where he had ever stood as the boss of anything. He walked to a small wooden door with a crayon flower still taped to it, and he knocked. Elena opened the door in a soft sweater, her hair loose over her shoulders. Behind her, Lily was asleep on the little bed, one arm around Mr. Buttons, and the other flung out across the pillow. Adriano didn't step inside. He spoke to her in a voice she had never heard him use in the whole 2 years she had lived in his house. Not the boss's voice. Not even the voice from the kitchen that night. A quieter one. Older. Plainer. "I am not a good man, Elena. I want you to know that before I say anything else. The world I live in is a dangerous one, and I cannot promise it will ever be simple. I cannot promise that you will not lie awake some nights worrying. I will not stand here and lie to you about the shape of my life." She didn't speak. She only held the doorframe with both hands and looked at him. "But there are things I can promise you," he said. "If you stay, I will be loyal to you in a way I have been loyal to almost no one in my entire life. I will love your daughter as my own, not because she is your daughter, but because somewhere along the way, without either of us noticing, she quietly became mine. And I will never, ever walk away from either of you. Not for anything this city has left to offer me." Elena's eyes filled slowly. The tears she had held back since the pier finally slipped free one after the other, tracking silently down her cheeks. She didn't brush them away. "Adriano," she whispered. She didn't have to search for the words. They had been sitting inside her, whole and waiting, since the night he had knelt on her behalf. "You believed my daughter the first time it counted," she said. "You believed a mother's word from the mouth of a child who could not even reach your knee. That is more than most men give in a lifetime." Adriano, who had not truly wept since he was a small boy in a marketplace, closed the small distance between them and pressed his forehead to hers. He let the tears come. The seasons turned quietly at the Marchetti estate. Lily's small blue chair never left the study. Somewhere between the summer and the fall, It stopped being a visiting chair and simply became a piece of the room, as permanent as the mahogany desk itself. She sat in it while Adriano worked, humming softly, drawing houses that grew a little less crooked with every passing month. In the kitchen, Elena taught her to crack eggs and to fold flour with both small hands, laughing when she wore more of it than the bowl did. In the library, Adriano pulled down old books that had not been opened in 20 years and read to her from them at bedtime, one careful page at a time. Mr. Buttons picked up a new stitched-up ear from the night at the warehouse. Lily refused to let anyone try to fix it further. She liked him better that way. A little braver, the corridors of the estate began to smell of cooking. Small crayons appeared on side tables. Laughter, quietly at first, and then without apology, moved through rooms that had not known the sound in living memory. That one spring afternoon in the back garden, with no ceremony and no audience beyond a robin in the hedge, Adriano offered Elena a simple silver ring on his open palm. She said yes before he had finished asking. The wedding was small and held in that same garden. Lily wore a white dress her mother had sewn herself and carried the rings on a tiny cushion and informed every guest present with enormous seriousness that she was officially in charge of the flowers. Years later, in that same long hallway where a 3-year-old had once stepped in front of her mother, Adriano Marchetti walked in through the front door after a long day. His face was calm, as it always was. The guards along the wall stiffened out of habit. Then from the far end of the corridor, a small voice rang out full of joy. Daddy. Lily, 5 years old now, taller, hair still messy, still afraid of nothing, came running down the exact stretch of floor where her whole life had once turned. Adriano dropped to one knee without a thought and caught her against his chest. She wound her arms around his neck and chattered about her day. At the far end of the hallway, Elena stood watching, softer around the eyes, and she smiled at both of them, standing in the very spot where his life had once been cold and empty. Adriano finally understood. A house that had known only power, secrets, and fear had, without his ever noticing, quietly become a home. The truth this story leaves behind is a gentle one. Family is not made by blood or by power or by the walls we build to protect ourselves. Family is made by the people who choose to stay, choose to love, and choose to protect until the very end. Have you ever met someone who quietly changed your entire life without ever meaning to? A child, a stranger, a small unexpected kindness that arrived at exactly the moment you needed it most. Please share your story in the comments below. We read every single one, and every word from your heart truly means the world to us. If this story touched you tonight, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, tap the like button, and share this video with someone who needs a little warmth today. Your support is the reason we can keep bringing these stories to you. Wishing every single one of you good health, a peaceful heart, and a life full of small joys every day.